let's pivot real quick to Martin Luther King, because I've been fascinated with that assassination of MLK for some time, and I'm not a conspiracy theorist. I usually have found over the years, in terms of investigations, that once you do get the evidence in front of you, once you do find information, there tends to be a relatively straightforward answer, and oftentimes life's not as complicated as we might imagine. But with MLK, it's a little bit different, and I've thought for some time now that there's more here. And by that, I mean that there are other factors at play. Now, with James Earl Ray, how do you square this loop, right? How do you say that this was the act of an individual who couldn't even keep himself out of jail for petty crimes, right? I mean, he was a failure, basically. And yet somehow he ends up looking like a university professor after dusting himself off or kind of going off the radar for a period of time. And then he ends up in Europe, where he gets arrested eventually. Talk to me about the MLK situation and what your perspective is on that.
Yeah, so it's interesting, by the way, because Oswald, when he killed Kennedy, was just turned 24 years old. We forget how young he was, and often, as you know, the people in their 20s might grow out of that feeling that they want to change the world through a bullet, and in their 50s, if it didn't happen, they might just be sitting around and watching all the reruns on TV. Ray was 40, was a year older than Martin Luther King. It's unusual all of a sudden at 40 to turn yourself on to become an assassin. And I believe that Ray is more of an enigma, a tougher case to solve. In the end, I'm convinced that Ray would have gone to prison and only stayed silent for one reason, and that was to protect family. No one else. He would have turned anyone else in. He had two brothers who were also ex-cons, and I think that they were looking for a payday out of a racist lawyer in St. Louis who was offering up to a $50,000 bounty. Doesn't sound like a lot to kill Martin Luther King Jr. when you think of what a life is worth. But for the Rays, that was like hitting a lottery ticket. And Ray thought it was possible. And what was his goal? His goal was to get to White Run, Rhodesia, or South Africa afterwards, because he thought he would have some safe haven there. So if you follow it, it's a small kitchen conspiracy. It is for money. And in the end, it's wider. But when I tell that to people, or they read the book, they're disappointed, Mike, because when I say conspiracy, they want a deep state conspiracy. They want a conspiracy with J. Edgar Hoover behind a fence in a dress, shooting at Martin Luther King or something like that. They don't want the shorter story of, an assassin doing it for payday.
Yeah, look, nobody wants J. Edgar Hoover in a dress. Thank you for that visual, and all the viewers of the Situation Report. Thank you for that visual. So you think essentially it was the act of an individual, in a sense, right? It was him going after this bounty, as opposed to the involvement of the feds in any way.
Yeah, and as a matter of fact, the feds were down the street that day in terms of Army intelligence, FBI. The security divisions that were down the street in a firehouse, not far. They had visuals on where King was staying at the hotel, at the Lorraine Motel, but they weren't there to protect him. They were there to spy on him, as you know. And one of the interesting things I don't know if Trump was aware of, when he signed the executive order that said, let's release the MLK files as well, MLK's family came out and said, we'd like to see the files beforehand. And the reason they said that is in the late 70s, when the House Select Committee finished its work, the Black Caucus was the one that said, we don't want everything out, because in those files are FBI surveillance tapes that were illegally obtained on King's private life, audio tapes and video recordings to show that he was a philanderer. J. Edgar Hoover intended to embarrass him and disgrace him in public. So that material's in the files, clearly has nothing to do with the assassination, and it should not be made public.
Yeah, I agree with the first part. I agree with the concept that the reason why they're concerned, and likely what we'll learn from the release of those files, are all sort of the atmospherics and the result of all that wiretapping and the surveillance that was going on Martin Luther King. And so I understand why the family would be pushing back and saying, we want to see everything before you release it to the public. But I would say this is, I think if we have another situation here, look, it was 2017 when President Trump said, let's review, and then it turns out that he did keep things still classified. I think if we go through that route again this time around, and there's material that's held back, I I don't even know how do you explain that, right? And if and more to the point, you would have to explain it. You would have to do a better job as a government to say this is why after all this time we are not releasing these pages or this material.
I think you're right. They put themselves into a corner on this because, I mean, you may have a different view of this, but one of the reasons, there are a number of reasons that I don't think Pompeo is in Trump 2.0 is because Trump feels a little bit had on the fact that it was Pompeo who argued very, very well when he was running the CIA that some of the documents in 2017 on the Kennedy assassination should still be withheld for confidentiality reasons. Now,
Any
there's a
idea?
different.
Let me ask you this. I'm sorry for interrupting, Gerald, but I'm mindful of time. But any idea or insight or thought as to why that was the case? Why fight, to keep these things classified? It can't just be because they don't want to release some social security numbers, right? I mean, and if that's the case, then say you see that line right there. That's a social security number that we've redacted. So what is it from your perspective, right? Because everybody's got crazy ideas about why they're not releasing this material or what they would expect to find if they saw it.
So wait, so you asked such a great question, and the answer is so unsatisfying. I'll give you just one quick example. One of the things that I and others who have studied the assassination have wanted for years was Angleton's testimony, his before the church committee in '75. They had redacted large portions of that. Then they released some of it in 2017, some in 2018, some in 2022. So still Pompeo and others are saying there are parts of this that cannot be released and redacted. In 2023, we finally got the entire thing. And Mike, guess what? I'm happy like to send these to you, but you know what they actually are redacting? They're redacting the fact that a Romanian defector was defected to the Norwegians and apparently exposed a great deal of the intelligence activity of Romania against Norway. And then there are words that are redacted, for instance, on another page. We passed it along to the French. It was taken by two sources to, and here's the new words, French counterintelligence. It very clearly showed that redacted Romanian and Soviet services. And this is, I say to myself, you were fighting to keep this secret after 60 years when people look at it and think that you're hiding some secret about who killed Kennedy. That's crazy. And in my view, they overclassified in these instances, and then they've held on to those classifications too long.